kind of seeing patterns where it seems like you're sleeping more and yet you're still more and more tired. In females, especially when we have a progesterone deficiency, one of the most classic symptoms that you will hear from these women is that they do not sleep well. If you know anything about progesterone, you would know that one of its amazing metabolites, pregnenolone, is one of the key drivers of calm, relaxation, grounding. The equivalent to progesterone to men, which is testosterone, is very underrated when it comes to sleep. Testosterone can and will improve sleep for many men. And because it is an anti-stress hormone, a pro-anabolic hormone. Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to the Nico Misleh Podcast. It is I, Nico Misleh, here today to talk to you about some really fun stuff. Today I thought we could talk a little bit more in depth about hormone replacement therapy, especially when it is in regards to sleep. I think this is a very, very, very important topic. It's not a super sexy topic necessarily. I mean, I don't think people love talking about sleep a lot, but I think it's probably the most underrated thing that is discussed when it comes to hormone replacement therapy and what hormones can do for sleep. So first and foremost, I think that it is very obvious to me as patients, especially age, one of the things that I notice more of is that they, in many ways, they sleep more. So for example, they tend to take naps once or maybe multiple times a day. They tend to, go to bed at reasonable times still, but they have more frequency in terms of waking up and having difficulty falling back asleep. Or at the very least, what they will tell me is, Nico, I have a quote unquote normal nights of sleep, but I wake up feeling really fatigued. Right. I wake up feeling tired still. So it's really interesting because, again, we're kind of seeing patterns where it would almost appear that, well, it seems like you're sleeping more and yet you're still more and more tired. It's clear to me, just from an obvious standpoint, that you're lacking energy. Right. I mean, that seems really obvious. But again, it's funny because in the conventional medical world, even though that makes total sense, it is looked at as, well, of course, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to get really old and your cells are supposed to fall apart and your mitochondria, those little powerhouses in your cells, are supposed to fall apart too. And there's really not a damn bit of thing we can do about it. Conservatively, maybe we tell you to go take some melatonin, buy some from your local grocery store, pharmacy or whatever, and take as much as you can. Or we turn to, therapeutics that are just so bizarre to me. So, common thing is I've had patients tell me that their medical providers prescribe to them. In fact, a lot of times they'll jump over melatonin and go straight to a, basically what is a psych medication called Trazodone for sleep. And again, I'm not disparaging you if you're on Trazodone or if you've prescribed Trazodone. I mean, that is just a common thing that is getting tossed around these days for sleep, for people who have difficulty with sleep. Now, granted, again, that could be, used in certain situations where there's some anxiety associated with that or whatever, but it doesn't really matter. In my opinion, I think it's a kind of inappropriate therapy. I mean, I've even seen things like benzos get tossed around for sleep and stuff. But again, it just appears that we're constantly turning towards whatever Band-Aid solution we can for people, and then or just writing them off and telling them, well, you're getting older. What are we supposed to do? If the conventional medicine provider is halfway decent, hopefully they look at things like maybe obstructive sleep apnea, which is a whole nother subject that maybe we can talk about another day. But I commend providers who do tell their patients, hey, you should really be checked out for obstructive sleep apnea, because of course, many people, especially women, it's getting way more popular in women nowadays to see, women getting evaluated for sleep apnea and getting treated for that, which I think is fantastic. But again, is there another root cause to that? And arguably, yeah, there usually is. Outside of the typical diet and lifestyle, of course, if you gain a whole bunch of weight and you eat really poorly and you don't exercise or do even, daily walks and things like that, yeah, of course, that weight gain is going to impact you tremendously. And it could lead to something like obstructive sleep apnea, could lead to many issues in terms of energy deficiencies and nutritional deficiencies. And we get that. Okay. So I'm not trying to focus on those things too much. I want to just assume going into this that you're smart and you understand all of those different variables and how they could impact us and our health and sleep. What I really want to dig into a little bit more is how hormones are involved with sleep. So even from a relatively young age, men and women who have hormone deficiencies or insufficiencies can absolutely experience really poor sleep because of said reasons. Again, I think it's pretty obvious in people who are aging, who are literally without these hormones, such as a menopausal female. It's like a no-brainer. We should absolutely be utilizing hormones for those individuals. And so I kind of want to talk about the spectrum here from young to old. In females, especially when we have a progesterone deficiency, one of the most classic symptoms that you will hear from these women is that they do not sleep well. If it is a younger female who is still cycling regularly, at least, let's just say, that female oftentimes is going to complain. If you ask, because you have to ask and you have to dig a little bit here. If you ask them, hey, tell me about your sleep. Well, it's not very good. Well, tell me exactly what you mean by that. When is it not good? Is it particularly in certain parts of your cycle? And of course, almost every female will say, yeah, right around, before my period starts, my sleep is kind of crappy and I feel really anxious and irritable and all that stuff. That's exactly the type of language that you're wanting to elicit and listen to, because likely that is what they're coming in for, which is a progesterone deficiency. That's what, again, most young women are suffering from. Progesterone is an obvious one because, again, if you know anything about progesterone, you would know that progesterone in and of itself is a wonderfully grounding hormone. And in particular, because one of its amazing metabolites, which is allopregnenolone, which I've talked about probably 1,000 times because I love it so much. Allopregnenolone is one of the key drivers of calm, relaxation, grounding. It hits on all the GABA receptors in the brain, especially, and helps induce that rest and relaxation, that very deep rest and relaxation, and it calms the central nervous system down. I mean, could you imagine if you had a progesterone deficiency and therefore a allopregnenolone deficiency, that you may encounter something so nasty as experiencing that type of insomnia and anxiety and irritability? Again, one of the more common things that we'd hear from these women, not only are they experiencing poor sleep, but they may wake up feeling anxious, which is odd, right? That may be something that they don't experience every single day of their life. It may just be certain weeks of their cycle, right? Or it may be that they do experience that every single day because their progesterone is just straight up, rock bottom. Like it can't get any lower. Again, those are things that we really want to pay attention to, because when you restore progesterone for those females, all of a sudden it's a literal light switch. It's like, wow, Nico, I can't believe how much better I'm sleeping. And I wake up and I don't feel anxious. I feel like myself again. That's amazing. So more commonly what you'll find, again, is in your females perimenopause, but especially menopause and beyond, none of those ladies sleep. They just don't get sleep because their progesterone is zero. And so again, if someone asked me, Nico, what is the most common symptom that a female will experience in menopause? I mean, I think stereotypically, a lot of people think hot flashes, night sweats, vaginal dryness, blah, 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 low mood. All those things are true. But I'll tell you, probably the one that is most consistent across all of my female patients, and again, kind of young and old, but especially menopause and beyond, is terrible sleep. Horrible sleep. This is the kind of sleep where, again, they have difficulty maybe falling asleep, but especially they wake up, and they almost always wake up right around 3 or 4 in the morning, and they can't fall back asleep. They may also then make terrible decisions throughout their day because they're so unbelievably fatigued that maybe they're consuming more coffee, or maybe they're eating more, which is, by the way, the body's natural response to low energy, which is what? Well, just consume more of it, right? And if you've ever been in a state of fatigue and feeling tired, let me just ask you, do you make great decisions around food and dietary choices? Typically not. Because again, your brain and your body is in this like fight or flight survival mode because it's so tired that you're naturally going to consume the two most energetic things possible, which is just straight up sugar and fat. And typically you're going to find that in a combination type of source, like a cookie or a donut or a cake. And that's again where things just really get, to a point where it's just unsustainable because you have no hormones. You can't sustain your energy. You can't sustain a healthy weight. You have a really hard time sustaining your mental health because said hormones are low, which makes you feel terrible, which also makes you feel tired. It's a vicious cycle. And so it's no wonder that when women hit perimenopause and especially menopause and beyond, they, especially in comparison to men, they gain weight. And that's especially that kind of central adiposity, that kind of almost truncal adiposity where it's really just hitting their waist and their bellies. And it's uncomfortable, of course, for them and maybe something they've never experienced before, or at the very least, they just can't seem to get rid of it. And that is such a, in my opinion, such a typical like stress signal type of weight gain. Because again, that weight gain is very specific. It's a weight gain that we typically would see, and again, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but it's something that we would typically find in patients with, say, like Cushing's syndrome, right? Where we have that very odd shape and size and adiposity more centrally located. And it is because it is being driven by excessive amounts of typically things like cortisol, right? And they don't produce enough of these more anabolic anti-stress hormones, even things like progesterone, to really combat that. And so that's where women end up especially. And I know I was supposed to be talking about sleep, but just to kind of give you a scope of how these things go and where they go. But so again, I think progesterone is a no-brainer when it comes to your female patients for sleep. I think it's imperative. I think it is far, far, far more significant than melatonin, for example. And by the way, I love melatonin. Like, I am a huge proponent of melatonin. I have a whole section of it in my adjunct hormone course within the HRT University Master Course because I love it so much. It's amazing. But frankly, I always tell people, melatonin is, in my humble opinion, less impressive of a quote unquote sleep hormone and way more impressive in terms of an antioxidant hormone, right? Its abilities to enhance mitochondrial output and improve, inflammation and decrease reactive oxidative species and all these different things. It's anti-cancer. Like, there are all these amazing things about melatonin that we love. And I love that practically a lot more than what it does for sleep. On the sleep side, really at the end of the day, if you look at most of the studies, where it's really good at, what melatonin is really good at is improving that sleep latency, right? The ability to fall asleep quickly. But it doesn't necessarily do an amazing job of always keeping you asleep. That's the challenge. So progesterone, on the other hand, is extremely good at that. It's extremely good at allowing, again, that central nervous system to really relax and calm down. And so, again, you can kind of ride the waves of sleep all the way until morning without any disruption. And that is exactly what your female patients will tell you is, hey, it's the first time I've basically slept the whole night through, and I woke up not feeling anxious, and I woke up feeling well rested. Perfect. Amazing. That's exactly what we're shooting for. But if there were another hormone, again, that I would say, which is kind of the equivalent to progesterone to men, which is testosterone, I think testosterone is very underrated when it comes to sleep and performance of sleep when it comes to men. So testosterone is, technically speaking, I would say very, sympathetic nervous system driven. Like, it's very dopaminergic, drive, motivation, right? All those sorts of things. You'll see men who, if they dose testosterone a little bit too high, whether it's injections or creams or something like that, it can affect their sleep very negatively. But what testosterone has also shown is that it does have some amount of a parasympathetic nervous system response, which is great. And because it is an anti-stress hormone, and a pro-anabolic hormone, it decreases inflammation. It decreases, all the nasty things that prevent us from recovering. Right. It helps control the immune system in many ways. It helps heal the gut. There's so many things that testosterone do indirectly, I think, for the human organism, that it also by default happens to generally improve sleep. So again, it's something that I remember, 7-10 years ago when I first started prescribing testosterone to men. That was some of the first things that a lot of my guys would tell me is like, hey, Nico, it's kind of crazy, but like, does testosterone help you sleep better? I remember, at that point, not knowing a ton about testosterone, I remember thinking like, I don't know. I don't think so. Like, I don't think that's a normal response that I would expect to hear from a patient. And yet when I looked into the literature, it was very clear like, oh, no, testosterone can and will improve sleep for many men, which I think is really fantastic. So again, when I have men coming to me complaining about sleep, one of the things, and again, I'm not trying to oversell or overpromise here, but one of the things I'll typically remind them of is, hey, I just want to let you know, when you start taking testosterone replacement therapy, you may notice that your sleep improves, which is awesome. And that's a great thing. So maybe don't go hog wild on the melatonin just yet. Maybe just hold off. Let's limit the variables and let's just see what this testosterone can do for your sleep. And again, a lot of guys will come back and say, hey, you were totally right. That was really helpful. But again, are there other things that we could consider for some of our male patients to help improve sleep? And I think one of them absolutely is something like pregnenolone or progesterone. And again, there's not a lot of hard science. In fact, there's basically no hard science behind giving pregnenolone or progesterone to men for most things, let alone sleep. But what I can tell you is that, anecdotally from my own, clinical experience working with patients and giving them either pregnenolone or progesterone. Remember, pregnenolone is kind of the mother hormone, so to speak, right? We have cholesterol molecules, and from those cholesterol molecules, we will derive through metabolism pregnenolone, and then that's kind of, again, the hormone that will then derive all the other hormones. So pregnenolone is a part of this pregnane family, which again, progesterone and allopregnenolone and all these preg hormones are kind of a part of, or progesterone, pregnenolone. Anyways, all these hormones have a very similar function in the sense of they're typically very anti-stress. They typically have a more calming and sedating type of effect, an anxiolytic type of effect. And that's what we see when we give human beings pregnenolone when they have schizophrenia or when they have generalized anxiety disorder or even major depressive disorder. We generally see an improvement in those symptoms, which is really interesting and fascinating. We don't really have a good understanding of how to dose it or what exactly it does because, again, it's a little bit difficult to know that with such limited data. But the vast majority of the pregnenolone that is taken orally, for example, it more or less stays as pregnenolone. The cells are very quick at essentially accumulating that pregnenolone rather than it just metabolizing down into DHEA and testosterone and all that stuff, which again is really interesting because, if you looked at that chart, right, logically speaking, if you said, oh, I have low testosterone, I'll just take a ton of pregnenolone, which is coming way before testosterone, and by default that will give me more testosterone. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen at all, basically. So again, most of the pregnenolone that you would take orally just stays as pregnenolone, but that can have really nice calming effects and anxiolytic effects. And again, typically speaking, you can take much bigger doses of that much more regularly as a male. Whereas with progesterone, you would have to be a little bit more conscientious about that. So progesterone in men, super controversial. Again, I've talked about this 1,000 times in my emails and different things like that. So if you've heard this before, I won't belabor the point, but progesterone is something that men produce, by the way, just like women produce testosterone. And we used to hear for decades and we still hear that women don't need testosterone. It's irrelevant. It's a male hormone, right? Well, I think the same rhetoric is true of men with progesterone. Do men produce progesterone? Of course. Do they produce a lot of it? No. But does that mean that it does nothing and it's just some garbage hormone that we make a little bit of? Absolutely not. It does a lot. And it does, frankly, the same thing for us that it does for women, which is to help calm the central nervous system, help us relax. Progesterone, ironically, let's just talk about sexual function for a moment and libido. Too much progesterone can kill your libido and kill your sexual function. The right amount of progesterone actually enhances your libido and sexual function. Why? Because it helps calm us a little bit. If you're too excited, right, especially as a guy, if you get too excited, well, you could experience some erectile dysfunction, right? We could have a little bit too much of that sympathetic drive, whereas much of the sexual function is actually more of a parasympathetic drive. And that is exactly what progesterone and its metabolite, allopregnenolone, play on so well. Fascinating, right? Super interesting. So it's not a hormone to write off for males. In fact, again, I have this in my master course. In the adjunct hormone course, I talk about the use of progesterone in men. I try to give as much background in terms of what literature we have on it, but it's extremely kosher and safe to give progesterone to men. It does depend on the dosing, which I go over in detail there. But I mean, we're looking at studies, again, one of the classic things that was touted it's still touted to this day, that progesterone causes like rampant amounts of inflammation in the male body. That's hogwash, guys. It's not true. There has literally been randomized control trials, not just like observational stuff. There was a randomized control trial where, and this was done like this year in 2025 or maybe 2024, within the last couple of years, they had used oral progesterone. I think it was oral progesterone. Might have been IM. Either way, they used progesterone in men in the ICU with COVID, the most inflammatory freaking disease known to man at this point. I think a lot of people would say. They gave the men progesterone, high doses, like 400 milligrams of progesterone. The men who got progesterone in the study had a much better clinical rate of recovery and were out of the hospital like 2 weeks earlier versus the men in the control arm who were not given progesterone. And what did they find? Significantly lower levels of inflammatory byproducts, your interleukines and your cytokines and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so progesterone is extremely safe for men. Progesterone inherently, by its nature, is generally speaking anti-inflammatory. It's very pro-immune system. Can it stimulate the immune system, much like estradiol and testosterone can? Absolutely, but that does not mean, we don't associate, just because we saw it in one little study a while back, that if you give some men progesterone, they may have some heightened inflammation markers. It doesn't mean that in the long term or at different dosages, or that at the end of the day, it has a very pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory response. That's why we love progesterone. So can progesterone also be used for men for sleep? Of course. So who are the men that I would typically give progesterone to? Men who complain of sleep, even with testosterone, even when things are going well, things seem optimal, their thyroid's better, they're losing weight, they're having a little bit more energy, but they're just still complaining of some of that fatigue, or they just wake up and they don't feel well rested, or maybe they're waking up once, twice, 3 times a night for no reason, and they just feel kind of, wired. I absolutely run to progesterone. And I typically, again, would prefer an oral route of progesterone. Why? Because if it's taken orally, it will go through a first pass effect through the liver and get more metabolization of that progesterone over to allopregnenolone. So again, we're not actually holding on to a whole bunch of progesterone. What we're actually shooting for is getting a little bit of that allopregnenolone from it to help induce sleep and relaxation. And what did my guys tell me? Nico, my gosh, I feel like $1 million. I'm sleeping better. By the way, my libido is better and my sexual function is better. Crazy. Just because we gave them a little bit of progesterone. Men who have had traumatic brain injuries, who have really significant, secondary hypogonadism, or maybe they have that kind of, secondary hypothalamic failure types of events, right? Where they just have a lot of inflammation in the brain or something happened up there that they're just not producing a lot of hormone. Those are guys who do really well with progesterone. They're guys who typically respond really favorably to testosterone and DHEA, for example. These are your gentlemen who, again, like the infamous Dr. Mark Gordon, who looked at men with TBIs having PTSD. We see a lot of benefit in those gentlemen when we add hormone replacement therapy in versus, say, I don't know, antipsychotic or antidepressant or whatever other thing that we throw at these poor gentlemen. We have found that, clinically speaking, a lot of times PTSD is related to a traumatic brain injury. And again, it doesn't have to be anything super significant. It doesn't have to be, I freaking blacked out and banged my head off a concrete floor. It could be, as simple as, I don't know, I got dinged in the head with a baseball and felt kind of headachy for a couple days. Like there are things that probably in your life, if you've ever had a TBI, you probably didn't realize it. Most of us encounter some sort of issue like that in our lifetime. And it very well could lead to something as significant as a TBI, and then ultimately, God forbid, PTSD or a variety of other mental health conditions, simply because we had some brain inflammation. So again, for those men, progesterone is oftentimes a no-brainer. There are a few men I will just go ahead and start them on progesterone who, again, have a very strong history of, I'll give you the kind of stereotypical patient that I would see this in. Usually a male, usually in his 40s or so, maybe served overseas or even at home. Maybe he was a police officer. Maybe he was in law enforcement and stuff. Maybe he was a first responder. He was a veteran, whatever. Had a history of getting conked on the head, maybe once, twice, several times. Exposures to all kinds of, night shift work and just shift work in general, high stress situations. These guys are burnt out. I mean, they are toast. And those guys who I'm talking about, right? And by the way, there are females who absolutely exist in this category too. I'm just specifying kind of what would be the very typical person that you would see in your clinic. They don't sleep well. They're probably on Trazodone. They're probably on an antidepressant. They probably gained a bunch of weight. They probably will tell you they sleep terribly and they wake up feeling anxious. Like a lot of times with those guys, I will go ahead and instead of just say like, let's just see what the testosterone does, I will a lot of times give them a little bit of either pregnenolone or progesterone to help just get these poor gentlemen back to baseline. I will tell you, not all of those guys end up needing pregnenolone and progesterone forever and ever and ever. Sometimes once we get things restored in terms of the testosterone side of things and maybe even thyroid, or they lose some weight, maybe we get a sleep study done and they have some really gnarly sleep apnea and we get that improved. It's not always that they have to take the progesterone and the pregnenolone either or, but again, these are guys who they're suffering tremendously, and without adequate sleep, it is really, really, really difficult to work with these guys. They're very reactive. They're very hyper emotional in a lot of ways. And I really like to create quick wins selfishly, because it kind of helps them buy into this and it helps them see the benefit rather than like just this very low and slow and arduous thing. I feel like these poor guys have kind of already gone through that for the past, 5-10 years with their other providers. And I just want to create a quick win for them right away. So again, I think it's silly to be overly fearful of hormones in the capacity that we're using them intelligently and logically for a very specific type of person and situation. I'm not giving progesterone to every single one of my guys. I can probably count on the number of fingers on my hand that how many men I actually give progesterone to. It's not that many, guys. You're not going to find a lot of use for it. But I think what is more silly is this idea that like progesterone would be a never, ever, ever for men, just like we would never say that about testosterone for women. Okay. We make these hormones, we make them for a reason. And just because we might not have a ton of literature around that doesn't mean that here's a good thing to really consider here, guys. One of my mentors always used to say this, and I think it's a pretty well-known saying in the functional medicine space at this point, which is, I am very interested in evidence-based medicine. I'm very passionate about it. I love evidence-based literature. In fact, my whole HRT University course, if someone asked me, Nico, is this evidence-based? 110%, like it is obnoxiously evidence-based. Asterisk, I am not burdened or chained to evidence-based medicine only, right? A great example would be that is there any use of progesterone in men from randomized control trials clinically in any way, shape, or form? Yes. Is it exactly for sleep at all? No. In theory and in practice and in scientific rigors, do we understand what progesterone is and what it does? Yes. Could we extrapolate from that based on what literature we do have about progesterone, and even to some degree, the functions it does in females? Because again, I understand we're totally different, agreed, but it's not to say that, we see, overwhelmingly testosterone, what it does for women, does a lot of the same stuff for men, right? Granted, it's in a different person, female to male, but like, does it grow muscles? Yes. Does it cause hirsutism? Yes. Does it cause androgenic effects? Absolutely. So could we not see those same effects from progesterone from women to men? Absolutely. I think those are things that we need to be emboldened by. This is science. We work off of advanced literature and data sets that has provided us this evidence-based literature that has been peer-reviewed and gone through all that stuff. That is critical. It really is. It's super important. But I'm not going to be chained up to that evidence-based literature because, again, God forbid if I give a man a tiny bit of progesterone to help him sleep, I feel really confident that's not going to just destroy this guy's life in any way, shape, or form, because I know from a scientific perspective, and this is why I love HRT University, because I try to talk you through that, right? This is almost like, when COVID was around, can't believe that was like almost 5 years ago now. But when COVID was around, vitamin D3 was like kind of being manhunted for a while. I was like, well, vitamin D3 is not going to save you. Well, I know it's not going to save you, but like what we did know was that if you had really low vitamin D3 levels, you were way more susceptible to COVID and way more likely to die from COVID in an ICU. And so the evidence-based literature, we didn't have, I'm talking early on, we didn't have like copious amounts of data to say, give this amount of vitamin D3 to a patient with this level. We didn't. But if I went off of evidence-based medicine and it was like, give 2,000 to 5,000 IUs once daily to a person who was like headed to the ICU or in the ICU, that would have been a damn travesty, right? So even the best medical providers in the highest levels of institutions in the most acute settings, we are still going off script a lot of the time, right? We're using things off label. We're using things in ways that maybe they're not exactly intended to be used or dosed or administered in ways that we didn't see in the, again, evidence-based literature. But it is because the evidence-based literature is not saying do it this way only. It is just saying when it is done in this way, these are the results that we get, and that's a signal. And the stronger the signal, the more likely we should probably try to adhere to whatever those principles are. Testosterone dosing for men, 200 milligrams, 1 ml once a week as an injection, I don't stick to that at all. That is basically in all the evidence-based medicine that we have around testosterone replacement therapy in men, that is how they give testosterone. Now, I give doses of all different ranges, and I give most of my guys inject at least 2 or 3 times a week minimum. Many of my guys use compounded creams, right? Do you see where I'm getting with this? The reason I'm doing those things is because, again, anecdotally and even theoretically, if I split that dose up, we're going to have less peaks and troughs, less significant peaks and troughs, I should say. So we'll have more stable levels, and my patients feel better, and their blood work looks better, and they tell me they feel better. So that's kind of the idea that we want to have in mind here, guys, when it comes to talking about things like sleep and what should we use for sleep, and is progesterone okay for men? Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to get off this subject for a second because I realize this whole podcast has now become a please give progesterone to men, but I feel really passionate about that because it's helped so many of my guys. But another thing people ask me, so okay, let's say we've done all the good stuff. We've given our men or women the hormones that are necessary to help improve upon sleep. They're definitely doing better. But hey, look, life is crazy and things happen, and maybe they just need a little extra oomph. Okay, maybe they need a little more firepower. absolutely melatonin. Again, I know I was just talking about how melatonin isn't like the best sleep hormone, but it can and should be used. Again, I have all the dosing very clearly laid out for men and women when it comes to melatonin. Another common misconception is that melatonin should be dosed like really, 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 really low. That's not true. It can be dosed at very high levels. In fact, melatonin does not turn off your melatonin production in your body. Literally every single cell in your body produces melatonin, and it has effects on the mitochondria and all this stuff. So you're not going to overwhelm anything with more melatonin. I mean, there are people megadosing melatonin at 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams, several hundred milligrams. We saw the use of that again, ironically, in COVID, because it was really potent as far as a immunomodulator in many ways and an anti-inflammatory. So melatonin, can that be added? Absolutely. And we should stack that. So again, melatonin helps, especially on the sleep latency side. Are there other things that can improve sleep? There are a couple things that I love. One is really cheap and one is really expensive. So let me talk about the super expensive one first. L-Theanine. I actually have a bottle. I don't know why I have this bottle sitting here. I was probably showing it to a patient. If you can see that, L-Theanine. It's probably not going to focus back there. Anyways, if you were watching me, I just held up a bottle of L-Theanine. It's expensive as hell, man. L-Theanine is super, super, super expensive, but my gosh, does it work really, really well. L-Theanine, again, much like progesterone and allopregnenolone in particular, acts on the GABA receptors. So does L-Theanine, and it works on them beautifully. It helps calm the central nervous system. The great thing about L-Theanine from like a daytime perspective is that it doesn't make you feel unbelievably groggy. In fact, what we've seen is if you give L-Theanine to, say, college kiddos before an exam, they'll do really, really well in that exam because it just calms their central nervous system down a little bit without making it overwhelming. And it doesn't, knock them out like a Benadryl would or something like that. So I love L-Theanine. It's just really expensive, and it's expensive especially because you got to take usually a lot more than what's suggested. So on this bottle, for example, one capsule has 200 milligrams of L-Theanine. That's kind of a low dose for a lot of people. Some smaller men and women likely could get away with that and maybe have some benefit. But I have a lot of guys who, and myself included, need 400 to 800 milligrams of L-Theanine just to honestly even notice the effects. And by the way, this bottle only has 60 capsules. So you'll just go through it really quickly. So I like to use L-Theanine for especially if I'm traveling and I just really need a solid night's sleep or two. Maybe I'm speaking at a conference or something like that. I will absolutely utilize L-Theanine in those situations because I'm going to stack as much as I can to help improve my sleep. So I'll use melatonin. I might use some L-Theanine, but if I couldn't use L-Theanine or I just didn't have the finances for it, maybe one of your patients saying, I can't afford all this stuff. That's totally reasonable. Here is my go-to. In my opinion, it is one of the best ever, the creme de la creme. Glycine. Good old-fashioned glycine. Again, it's just an amino acid. Super cheap. I'm talking for a bottle, like a big old bottle of it. It costs probably around 20 or 30 bucks. That's probably, I don't know, that could be 3 months worth of medicine, so to speak, in there of the glycine. Glycine, again, it's an amino acid. And it comes typically as a powdered form. So again, this is one of maybe the cons of glycine. You can get it in capsules, but you got to take a freaking ton of them. If it comes in a powdered form, that is where the cost effectiveness comes in. It tastes fine. It tastes like table sugar. And honestly, it's this consistency of table. It looks like granulated table sugar, kind of gritty. And it literally looks and tastes like it's very sweet. It's practically acaloric, meaning it's not like literally sugar. It's not going to destroy your blood sugars or anything like that. But you can take just a heaping teaspoon, which is relatively speaking around 3 grams, a good solid teaspoon, and mix it in a little bit of water, whatever you like, juice, tea, things like that. And it dissolves. It'll dissolve kind of slowly in cold water. It usually really won't. If you dissolve it in a warm tea, it dissolves beautifully. You knock that back. At least I always tell my patients 30 minutes to 60 minutes before bed, right? I want to initiate that sense of calm and relaxation, like, again, 30 to 60 minutes before bed. So you're like in that state of calm relaxation when you're hitting the pillow, not you take it 3 seconds before bed and now it's going to take 30 minutes to kick in and you're going to start thinking of things and it's just going to derail you. So if especially sleep is difficult for you, take it earlier. But glycine has been shown in many, many, many studies at this point to absolutely enhance the quality of sleep. It seems to, we're sleep is a weird thing because we don't actually really understand it that well, but it seems to induce deeper levels of sleep, right? It's allowing you to hit the cycles better, REM cycle and deep, light, deep, whatever REM cycles you're kind of hitting throughout the nighttime period. Glycine is incredible at allowing you to get through all those cycles. And what people will report is that when they wake up, they have a better, more restful sleep. The quality is better, and it's very clear and it's very obvious to them, which is really exciting. And you can just up that dose as much as you want, of course. So it's just an amino acid. You're not going to kill yourself. If 1 teaspoon doesn't work, try 2. If 2 doesn't work, try 3. Most people, the vast majority of my male and females who take glycine, 1 teaspoon is plenty. I will warn them and say you'll have some very vivid dreams because you're just going to have these really deep sleeps, which is cool. So you also know it's working. But glycine, again, is so cost effective. It's super, super easy to take. Traveling with it is a pain. That would be a time where I would opt for capsules. But, otherwise, if it's just a home routine thing, it's fantastic. And so, again, your routine could be something like, whether you're male or female, taking your progesterone with your melatonin and your glycine. That is a huge, very powerful sleep stack for most people. And again, it avoids some of the stuff that also could work. Okay. So there's CBD and CBN, which is the cannabinoids of marijuana or cannabis or hemp, for example, we can process through those things. But again, those are very expensive. I don't feel like they work as well as this stuff does. THC is oftentimes used for sleep. And again, I'm not opposed to a little bit of THC, especially if it's paired with some CBD, because it kind of counteracts a lot of the psychoactive effects. But THC is a bit like alcohol. Can it induce sleepiness? Yes. But do you get restful sleep with THC use or with alcohol use? No, you don't. So it's a little bit like an Ambien, right? Will it put you in a zombie-like state? Sure. Is it optimal for you in terms of your overall health outcomes? Not really. So I'd much rather play my chips on the table when it comes to sleep on hormones first, and then any secondary things that we could add in there. And I think there's just the nutraceuticals, including melatonin, which is hormones, are fantastic. And I think that should be really the way we go about sleep for 99% of our patients, be they female or male. So I hope this has been helpful, guys. As always, when you're thinking about sleep, and you're an HRT nerd, think about it through the lens of HRT. How could I optimize this potentially with the use of hormones, first and foremost? And then what are other things I could potentially add in here that are simple, readily available, cost effective, and they're only going to add to the benefits of hormones at large, which are things like, again, glycine and or L-Theanine. So I hope this has been helpful, guys. Again, if you're new to the channel and the podcast, welcome. I'm so thankful that you're listening. Please don't forget that I have a course. It's called HRT University. And if you visit hrtuniversity.com, you can learn all about it. It's incredible. We help providers transform the way they think about hormones. We make it exciting. We want you to treat patients with hormones. We need you to. Our community and our world relies on you helping these people live long and healthy lives and lives full of meaning and purpose. And I think hormones do that better than just about anything else. So please check out hrtuniversity.com. I have a daily email. I literally write it Monday through Friday, just me, no ChatGPT. It's in the links under the show notes. All this stuff will be in the links under the show notes. So if you click on that, it's free. You can hop in there and I write killer articles. I try to provide as much value as possible to you Monday through Friday, learning about HRT and business stuff and just medicine at large. Cool stuff that goes on in our world today. And then last but not least, I also have a Facebook group, which is under Nico's HRT University. If you search that in Facebook, and again, if you look at the show notes here, you'll find that as well. Join us. It's a great place to hang out for the most part and just kind of get your feet wet in terms of hormones and see what other providers across the country are doing, and honestly across the world. We got people in there from Australia and Canada and all kinds of different places. So it's a great place to, again, kind of network and meet up. And we share, again, a lot of our podcasts and daily emails and things like that in there too. So, all right, guys, thank you so much. Hope this has been helpful, and I will see you at the next episode. Take care.